Clara Evans had always believed her calling was to bring light into the lives of children who needed it most. As a social worker in Midvale, a small town with long winters and few opportunities, she worked tirelessly to connect foster children with families that could give them love, stability, and a place to belong. While Clara lived paycheck to paycheck, her spirit brimmed with a richness that no amount of money could match, a quiet determination to make life better for others. Her days were often long, filled with court appointments, house visits, and endless paperwork. But the hardest part wasn't the bureaucracy. It was the waiting, the stretch of time children spent hoping for someone to choose them. Some kids were lucky, finding homes quickly, but others waited for months or years, their hope flickering like a fragile candle. Clara carried their struggles in her heart, knowing too well how rejection left unseen scars. On a particularly cold December afternoon, Clara met Joshua. He was 7 years old, small for his age, with round brown eyes that seemed wiser than they should have been. His file, which Clara had reviewed that morning, was brief. Joshua had been placed in foster care 6 months earlier when his mother fell ill and could no longer care for him. His father was absent, and there were no relatives to take him in. He was described as quiet, with a love for drawing and building things, an imaginative boy who just needed a safe space to thrive. When Clara arrived to take Joshua to his routine check-in appointment, he was standing in the chilly parking lot, clutching a worn backpack. His coat was too thin for the sharp wind, and Clara frowned slightly as she helped him into the back seat of her old Honda Civic. "Hi, Joshua," she said warmly, glancing at him through the mirror. "How are you feeling today?" Joshua shrugged, pulling his backpack close. Clara didn't press him to talk. She knew children in foster care often built walls to protect themselves from disappointment. Instead, she smiled as she started the car. "You know," she said brightly, "I heard there's a toy store nearby that's having a big sale. Want to take a look after the appointment?" Joshua hesitated, his gaze flickering to meet hers in the mirror. For a moment, his brown eyes lit up before he looked away. Maybe he mumbled, but Clara could tell he was intrigued. After the check-in, Clara parked in front of the small toy store nestled between a bakery and a hardware shop. The shop window was filled with colorful displays of stuffed animals, action figures, and building sets. As they stepped inside, a warm wave of air greeted them, carrying the scent of new plastic and cardboard. Joshua lingered near the door, his eyes scanning the shelves with quiet curiosity. "Take your time," Clara said gently. She stayed a few steps behind as he wandered, her gaze following him. Joshua stopped at a display of toy construction sets, his small fingers brushing over a bright red box. It was a building kit, complete with tiny bricks, tools, and figures. He picked it up, studied the cover, and carefully put it back, his expression unreadable. Clara walked up beside him. "Do you like that one?" she asked softly. Joshua hesitated, then gave a small nod. "It's cool," he said, but quickly added, "I don't need it." Clara recognized the tone, a careful defense against disappointment. Her heart ached as she reached for the box, turning it over in her hands. "You know," she said, crouching down to his level, "every builder needs a good set of tools. What do you say we make this your early Christmas gift?" Joshua blinked, his round eyes widening in disbelief. "Really?" he whispered. "Really," Clara said, smiling. "Every great builder deserves a great start." The boy's hands hovered near the box, his expression a mix of joy and uncertainty. Slowly he took it, cradling it as though it were a treasure. "Thank you, Miss Clara," he murmured, his voice filled with genuine surprise. The warmth in his tone made the cost of the toy feel like nothing at all. On the drive back to his foster home, Joshua sat quietly in the back seat, holding the bag on his lap. For the first time since Clara had met him, his posture seemed a little lighter, as though the weight he carried had eased just a little. Over the next few weeks, Clara found herself thinking about Joshua often. At night, as she sat at her kitchen table sorting through paperwork, she would picture him bent over his building set, creating something colorful and imaginative. The thought gave her a sense of hope that carried her through the long, cold days. On a particularly snowy afternoon, Clara received an email from the foster care coordinator, Mrs. Harrington. The subject line made Clara's heart skip: potential placement for Joshua Lewis. She quickly opened the email, scanning its contents. A couple, the Richfields, had expressed interest in fostering Joshua. They lived in a neighboring town, and their file described them as kind, stable, and well-resourced. "They're interested in Joshua," Clara murmured to herself. She felt a cautious flicker of hope. The Richfields seemed like the kind of family that rarely entered her world, one with the means and commitment to offer a child more than just a house, but a true home. Later that day, Clara visited Joshua's current foster home, a small, crowded apartment run by Mrs. Chen. Joshua was sitting cross-legged on the floor, his construction set spread out around him. He had built a tiny city, complete with colorful towers, winding roads, and a bridge that arched over a river drawn on paper. "Wow," Clara said, crouching down beside him. "This is incredible. What's the story behind it?" Joshua looked up at her shyly. "It's a city for superheroes," he said. "They're safe here." Clara's chest tightened at his words, but she smiled. "You've got quite an imagination, Joshua. I bet you'd be a great city planner someday." He gave a small smile, but his gaze lingered on her. "Miss Clara," he said softly, "why do you look sad?" The question caught her off guard. "I'm not sad," she said gently. "I was just thinking about something." "Like what?" "Well," Clara began, sitting cross-legged beside him, "I have some news. There's a family that might want to meet you. They're really nice, and they're excited to learn more about you." Joshua stared at her, his expression uncertain. "Like a forever family?" he asked hesitantly. "Maybe," Clara said. "Nothing's decided yet, but they want to meet you and see if it could be a good fit." Joshua looked down at his city, his hands resting on one of the towers. "What if they don't like me?" he whispered. Clara's heart ached at his vulnerability. She placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Joshua, you're an incredible kid. If they get to know you, they'll see that. And even if it doesn't work out, I'll be here, okay? You're not alone." He nodded slowly, though the uncertainty in his eyes remained. Clara stayed by his side a little longer, watching as he carefully added to his city, her own hope growing quietly in her heart. The first meeting with the Richfields was scheduled for the following week at a nearby community center and neutral, comfortable space Clara often used for introductions. In the days leading up to it, she spent extra time preparing Joshua, encouraging him to talk about his interests and practice answering questions. She wanted him to feel confident, even if nerves crept in. On the morning of the meeting, Clara arrived at Joshua's foster home with a small gift in hand, a new sweater in a soft gray knit. "For today," she said with a smile as she handed it to him. Joshua's fingers brushed over the fabric, his face lighting up briefly. "Thanks, Miss Clara." As they drove to the community center, Joshua sat quietly in the back seat, clutching the straps of his backpack. Clara glanced at him in the mirror. "How are you feeling, buddy?" "Okay," he murmured, though his grip on the backpack tightened. Clara decided not to push him. She knew how overwhelming this moment must feel. The Richfields were already waiting when they arrived. Elise Richfield stood by the entrance, her kind smile framed by soft waves of chestnut hair. Beside her was Andrew, tall and steady, with a calm demeanor that balanced Elise's warmth. They stepped forward as Clara and Joshua approached, their movements gentle and unhurried. "Hi, Joshua," Elise said, crouching down so she could meet him at eye level. "I'm Elise, and this is Andrew. We've been so excited to meet you." Joshua glanced at Clara, who gave him an encouraging nod. Then he looked back at Elise and said softly. Andrew extended a hand. "Nice to meet you, Joshua. I heard you're really good at building things." Joshua hesitated but eventually shook Andrew's hand. "I like making cities," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elise's smile widened. I'd love to see one of your cities someday. Maybe you could tell us about them." The boy's eyes flickered with interest, and he gave a small nod. Clara watched the exchange with cautious optimism, her heart swelling at the patience and care the Richfields showed. Inside the community center, Elise and Andrew guided Joshua to a table where they had set up a small art station with paper, crayons, and markers. "We thought you might like to draw while we chat," Elise said. "No pressure, though, just if you feel like it." Joshua's face softened as he sat down and began to draw quietly. Clara stayed nearby, observing the interaction. The Richfields didn't push Joshua to talk but gently asked questions about his favorite colors, books, and activities. When Joshua mentioned his construction set, Andrew leaned forward. "What's the coolest thing you've built so far?" Joshua hesitated for a moment, then said, "A city for superheroes. They're safe there." Andrew nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That sounds amazing. Maybe I could help you build something like that someday." For the first time, Joshua looked directly at Andrew and gave a small, tentative smile. Clara's heart soared at the sight. As the meeting progressed, Joshua grew more comfortable, his answers coming a little easier. By the end of the hour, he was sitting beside Elise, showing her his drawing a colorful cityscape with winding roads and tall towers. Elise listened intently, her face glowing with genuine interest. When it was time to leave, Joshua clutched his drawing tightly as he stood by Clara's side. "Bye," he said softly to Elise and Andrew. "Bye," Joshua, Elise said warmly. "We hope we can see you again soon." In the car on the way back, Clara glanced at Joshua in the rearview mirror. "You did great today, buddy. I'm really proud of you." Joshua didn't say anything at first, but after a moment he murmured, "They were nice." They were, Clara agreed, a smile spreading across her face. "And no matter what happens, you should feel proud of yourself." Joshua nodded, his gaze drifting out the window, and Clara couldn't help but hope that this time, things might truly work out. The days following Joshua's meeting with the Richfields were filled with a mixture of cautious optimism and quiet anticipation. Clara's role shifted from advocate to guide as she helped Joshua prepare for the possibility of living with the Richfields. At the same time, she worked closely with Elise and Andrew to ensure they understood the delicate nature of fostering a child like Joshua, one who carried deep-seated fears of rejection. Clara arrived at Joshua's foster home one afternoon with a small bundle of books she had picked up from a secondhand store. "Thought you might like these," she said, handing them to him. "There's one about building bridges and another about how cities are planned." Joshua's eyes lit up as he flipped through the pages. "Thanks, Miss Clara." She sat down beside him on the floor, where his construction set was spread out in its usual colorful sprawl. "How are you feeling about the Richfields?" she asked gently. Joshua hesitated, his hands fiddling with a tiny red brick. "They're nice," he said finally, but his voice was tinged with uncertainty. "What if I mess up?" Clara's heart ached at the question. "Oh, Joshua," she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder, "you're not going to mess up. Families don't expect you to be perfect, they just want you to be yourself. And the Richfields seem like the kind of people who will appreciate you exactly as you are." He looked at her with wide, searching eyes. "Do you think they'll want me to stay?" Clara gave him a warm smile. "I think they see how special you are, Joshua. But remember, this is about finding the right fit for both of you. And no matter what, I'll be here to help, okay?" Joshua nodded slowly, some of the tension in his small shoulders easing. That week, Clara scheduled the first home visit to the Richfields' house. She picked up Joshua early on a chilly Saturday morning, bundling him in his new sweater and a scarf she had knitted herself. His backpack was slung over his shoulder, the toy construction set peeking out from the top. As they pulled up to the Richfields' home, Clara couldn't help but feel a pang of nervousness on Joshua's behalf. The house was warm and inviting, with soft light glowing through the windows and a wreath hanging on the front door. Elise and Andrew stepped outside to greet them, their smiles genuine. "Welcome, Joshua," Elise said, her voice warm. Come on in, we've been looking forward to this. Inside, the Richfields had set up a cozy corner in the living room, just for Joshua. There was a small table with art supplies, a soft rug, and even a bookshelf stocked with new building kits and picture books about architecture. Joshua's eyes widened as he took it all in. "This is for me," he asked softly. "It is," Andrew said, crouching down to Joshua's level. "We thought you might like a space to create whatever you want." Joshua didn't say anything, but he placed his backpack carefully on the floor and sat down at the table. Clara watched as he ran his fingers over the art supplies, his expression a mix of wonder and cautious hope. Over the next few hours, the Richfields worked to make Joshua feel comfortable. Elise showed him the kitchen, pointing out where he could find snacks, while Andrew offered to help him set up a new project with the construction set he had brought from home. Clara stayed in the background, observing the way the Richfields interacted with Joshua. Their patience and kindness reassured her that this placement might truly work. As the visit drew to a close, Joshua was curled up on the rug, flipping through one of the new books. Elise knelt beside him. "We're really glad you came today, Joshua," she said softly. "We hope you'll come back again soon." Joshua looked up at her, his expression shy but open. "Okay," he said quietly. When Clara drove him back to Mrs. Chen's apartment, he was unusually quiet. She glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "They're nice," he said simply. But the way he clutched the book he'd brought home told Clara that he was beginning to imagine a life with the Richfields. In the following weeks, the Richfields formally expressed their intent to foster Joshua. Clara worked tirelessly to finalize the paperwork and schedule the necessary court dates. Each night, as she sat at her kitchen table reviewing the details of his case, she found herself thinking about the long road that had brought them to this point. Joshua's placement wasn't just a win for him, it was a reminder of why Clara did this work, despite the exhaustion and sacrifices it demanded. On the day of Joshua's official placement, Clara arrived early to pick him up. He was waiting at the door with his backpack, his small body bundled against the cold. "Are you ready, buddy?" Clara asked, kneeling to meet his gaze. Joshua hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, Miss Clara. Can you come with me?" Clara's chest tightened. "Of course," she said gently. "I'll be there every step of the way." When they arrived at the Richfields' home, Elise and Andrew were waiting on the porch. Elise opened her arms in a gesture that was both welcoming and patient. "Hi, Joshua," she said warmly. "We're so happy you're here." Joshua stepped forward slowly, his backpack slung over one shoulder. As he walked into the house, Clara stayed behind, watching from the doorway. Elise glanced back at her and smiled. "You've done so much for him, Clara. Thank you." Clara nodded, emotion thick in her throat. "He's a special boy. You're lucky to have him." Elise's eyes softened. "We are." As Clara drove home that evening, she felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her. Joshua was safe, he was wanted. And for the first time, he had a real chance at a brighter future. Clara knew her work wasn't finished. There would always be more children to help, more challenges to face, but for now, she let herself rest in the knowledge that she had made a difference. The first days at the Richfields' home were a cautious exploration for Joshua. He carried his backpack everywhere, as though it were an anchor in unfamiliar waters. Inside it were his toy construction set, a few books Clara had given him, and the drawing he had made of his superhero city. Elise and Andrew let him adjust at his own pace, giving him space to explore the house while quietly encouraging him to join them in small ways. On the second evening, Joshua sat at the kitchen table as Elise prepared dinner. The soft hum of conversation filled the space. Andrew talked about his day at work while Elise chopped vegetables. Joshua listened quietly, his small hands clutching the edge of his chair. "Joshua," Elise said gently, "would you like to help me set the table?" Joshua looked up, his eyes searching hers for a moment before he nodded. Elise handed him a stack of plates, and he followed her instructions carefully, placing each one on the table with precise movements. When he was done, she smiled. "Thank you. You're a big help." Joshua's lips twitched into the faintest smile as he slid back into his seat. By the end of the week, Joshua's guarded nature began to soften. He spent more time at the art table Elise and Andrew had set up for him, drawing colorful cities and crafting small towers with his building kits. One afternoon, Elise found him sitting cross-legged on the rug, his head bent over a new creation. "What are you working on today?" she asked, crouching down beside him. "It's a school," Joshua said softly. "For kids who don't have one." Elise's heart ached at the quiet sincerity in his voice. "That's a wonderful idea," she said. "What kind of things would your school have?" Joshua thought for a moment, his brow furrowing in concentration. "Lots of books, and toys, and a big playground." Elise smiled. "I'd want to go to that school." Joshua glanced up at her, his eyes filled with a tentative hope. "Really? Really," Elise said warmly. "You're an amazing builder, Joshua." Meanwhile, Clara stayed in close contact with the Richfields, scheduling weekly check-ins to monitor Joshua's adjustment. Each visit filled her with a sense of quiet pride as she watched him grow more comfortable. During one check-in, Clara sat on the plush couch in the living room, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. Joshua was at his art table, drawing a new cityscape while Elise sat nearby, watching him with gentle encouragement. "He's settling in so well," Elise said softly. "At first I worried we were pushing him too much, but now he's starting to open up. Yesterday he asked Andrew to help him build a bridge with his construction set. It was such a small thing, but it felt so big." Clara smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "That's Joshua. He takes his time, but once he trusts you, he lets you into his world." Andrew, who had just entered the room, nodded in agreement. "He's incredible. Watching him build those cities, you can tell he's imagining a whole world where everything is safe and secure." Clara's chest tightened at his words. "That's all he's ever wanted," she said softly. Despite the progress, there were moments of hesitation and uncertainty. One evening, as Elise tucked Joshua into bed, he clutched his blanket tightly and looked up at her. "What if you change your mind?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Elise sat beside him, her heart breaking at the fear in his eyes. "Oh, Joshua," she said gently, stroking his hair. "We're not going anywhere. This is your home now, and we're so glad you're here." Joshua searched her face for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Okay." As she turned off the light and left the room, Elise wiped away a tear, determined to show him every day that he was safe and loved. For Clara, Joshua's placement brought a sense of fulfillment, but it also left her reflecting on her own life. One cold evening, she sat at her kitchen table with her journal, the small space illuminated by the glow of a thrifted Christmas tree. She thought about the sacrifices she made, long hours, low pay, the emotional toll of her work, and the moments that made it all worthwhile. Opening her journal, she wrote, "Joshua is safe now. That's the goal, isn't it? To give these kids a chance to build something beautiful out of the broken pieces life has handed them. I can't fix everything, but I can give them a start. And sometimes that's enough." She closed the journal, a sense of peace settling over her. Her work wasn't finished, there were still more children to help, more families to guide, but for now, she let herself savor the quiet joy of knowing that Joshua had found his home. As weeks turned into months, Joshua began to thrive in the warmth and stability of the Richfields' home. The cautious boy who once clutched his backpack tightly and spoke in whispers had started to bloom. He spent his days drawing colorful blueprints, building sprawling cities, and even joining Andrew in the garage to construct small wooden projects. Elise reveled in his progress, cherishing each new smile, laugh, and moment of trust. One spring evening, Elise and Andrew sat in the living room after dinner, watching Joshua as he meticulously worked on a new city layout. His brow furrowed in concentration as he explained to Andrew where the superhero headquarters would go. Elise leaned toward Andrew, lowering her voice. "Clara made this possible," she said, Her persistence, her belief in him, it's what brought us together. Andrew nodded thoughtfully. She gave Joshua hope when he needed it most. And us, too. I've been thinking. We should do something to show her how much she's impacted not just Joshua, but our family. Elise's face softened with a quiet determination. Not just her. There are so many kids like Joshua still waiting. Maybe we can help Clara expand what she's already doing. Andrew smiled, reaching for Elise's hand. I think that's a perfect idea. A week later, Clara was surprised to receive an invitation to dinner at the Richfields' home. Though she usually kept her visits professional, she accepted, curious about the gesture. When she arrived that evening, she was greeted by the warm glow of the Richfields' home and the familiar sight of Joshua rushing to the door. "Miss Clara," he exclaimed, holding up a drawing. "Look, I made this for you." Clara knelt down to examine the picture. It was a colorful crayon sketch of a city, but at its center stood a figure with a big smile and a long coat. Above the figure, Joshua had written in careful letters, "Miss Clara's building." Tears prickled Clara's eyes as she looked at him. "This is beautiful, Joshua. Thank you." Elise and Andrew welcomed Clara inside, leading her to the dining room, where a cozy table was set for 4. The evening was filled with laughter and stories, and Clara couldn't help but feel the warmth of being part of this family's happiness. As dessert was served, Andrew cleared his throat, drawing her attention. "Clara," he began, "we've been thinking about everything you've done for Joshua and for us. You believed in him when no one else did. You fought for him to have this chance. We'll never be able to thank you enough." Clara shook her head, her cheeks flushing. "You don't need to thank me. This is what I do. It's what I'm here for." Elise leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "And that's why we want to help you do more. You've dedicated your life to helping children like Joshua, often at great personal sacrifice. Andrew and I have been talking, and we've decided to make 2 donations. First, $10. 000 will go to the foster care system to support children like Joshua and their families." Clara's breath caught at the amount. "That's incredible," she said softly. "This will help so many kids." Andrew smiled, handing her an envelope. "And this is for you personally, $2,500 to help with anything you need. We know how hard you work, and we want to make sure you're supported too." Clara stared at the envelope, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it. Her eyes widened at the check inside. I don't know what to say. You have no idea how much this means." Elise placed a hand over Clara's. "You've already done so much, Clara. We just want to make sure you can keep doing what you do best." The donations created a ripple effect within the foster care system in Midvale. Clara worked closely with the Richfields and Mrs. Harrington to allocate the $10,000, creating new resources for children and foster families alike. They established a program to provide kids with art supplies, books, and extracurricular activities, ensuring they had opportunities to thrive. Winter coats and school supplies were distributed to foster homes, and a mentorship initiative was launched to connect older children with community members who could guide them toward brighter futures. The personal gift allowed Clara to catch up on overdue bills, repair her car, and even set aside a little money for emergencies. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of financial stability, freeing her to focus on her work with renewed energy. Several months later, Clara stood at the edge of a brightly lit community center, watching as children and foster parents gathered for a program kickoff event. Tables were filled with art supplies, and a group of teenagers worked together to build a large wooden bridge model under the guidance of a local architect. Joshua was among them, his face glowing with excitement as he explained his design ideas to Andrew, who had volunteered to help at the event. Elise approached Clara with a smile, holding 2 cups of coffee. "It's incredible to see all of this come together," Elise said, handing her a cup. Clara nodded, her eyes scanning the room. "I never thought I'd see this kind of support for these kids. It's more than I could have hoped for." Elise placed a hand on her shoulder. It's because of you, Clara. You started this. You believed in Joshua. And now so many others will get the same chance. Clara looked down, her voice soft. It's because of all of us. None of this would have been possible without your generosity. Elise smiled, her eyes glistening. We're just following your example. As the evening wound down, Clara found Joshua standing by a display of his drawings, proudly showing them to Elise. He turned to Clara and grinned. Miss Clara, look, they put my superhero city up on the wall. Clara crouched down beside him, her heart swelling with pride. It's amazing, Joshua. You've come so far. Joshua hesitated for a moment, then hugged her tightly. Thank you, he said softly. Clara blinked back tears, her voice steady as she replied, You're welcome, Joshua. You're going to do great things, I know it. As she left the community center that night, Clara stepped into the cool evening air, her heart full. The journey had been long and often difficult, but moments like this reminded her why she kept going. One act of kindness, one moment of belief, could create ripples that changed countless lives. And tonight those ripples shone brightly, spreading hope in every direction.